So, Jonathan,
Yeah.
you are a bit of a rare breed. I mean, you're a self-proclaimed coffee historian. You wrote the excellent book, Coffee, A Global History, which frankly, if you hadn't done that, this series would never have been made. But seriously, how does one become a coffee historian? What was your journey to it?
Well, James, it's a bit of a circuitous route. Would you believe it? When I grew up, I really didn't like coffee. But the story goes, back in the 80s, I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, studied history there. I wanted to take a year to study sort of more modern politics, and I went to an American university in Bologna in Italy.
Okay.
And because I didn't speak the language, the way I learned Italian was in my interaction in all those little shops.
Oh, yeah.
Including, of course, coffee bars.
Oh, right.
Yeah, where I spent quite a lot of time attempting to talk to the baristas as almost like a language exercise. Could I get what I wanted? And that's really how I got into coffee drinking as part of that whole Italian style of life. I then wanted to go and do my doctorate in Italian history.
Uh-huh.
And working with this historian, a guy called Adrian Littleton, I was telling him about how I was really fascinated by all these small shops because it was so different from the UK, which is full of large chains, basically. So he said, well, there is one place that you should do that, and that is Milan, because they have this newspaper that was written for shopkeepers in the late 19th century.
Oh, really?
And so, lo and behold, I went to Milano, and I lived in Milano for about 13 months, and I went nearly every day to the Brera Library and read literally all the editions for 20 years plus of this newspaper.
Wow.
I published a book with the hugely sexy title, The Political Economy of Shopkeeping in Milan,
Wow.
1885 to 1922.
That's so hyper niche.
It is.
But
it is.
your Italian must have got a lot better.
My Italian did get a lot better.
And so I'm guessing once you became a professor of Italian history, that was a natural transition to coffee history?
Basically, I continued my academic career, and I started by doing a research project into the history of espresso that I called The Cappuccino Conquests. And from then, really, I realized that, I wanted to be a coffee historian more than an Italian historian. And I eventually published the book, Coffee, A Global History.
And when you talk about the history of espresso, Italian espresso, and its popularity globally, you being in Milan in the mid-80s, that was the time and the place where coffee history changed pretty dramatically.
Absolutely.
When you had your head buried in the Milan library, looking at old editions of that magazine, an American stepped out of his hotel and made his way to a trade show.
Yeah, the man known as Howard Schultz, I believe we're referring to.
Howard Schultz, Mr. Starbucks himself.
Became Mr. Starbucks.
And so what happened to Howard Schultz on that morning in the mid-80s as he's walking towards a trade show in Milan?
Well, James, I can tell you that because he wrote about that experience in his first book. I love to walk, and Milan is a perfect place for walking. Just as I started off, I noticed a little espresso bar. I ducked inside to look around. A cashier by the door smiled and nodded. Behind the counter, a tall, thin man greeted me cheerfully, "Buongiorno," as he pressed down on a metal bar and a huge hiss of steam escaped. He handed a tiny porcelain demi-tasse of espresso to one of the three people who were standing elbow to elbow at the counter. Next came a handcrafted cappuccino, topped with a head of perfect white foam. The barista moved so gracefully that it looked as if though he were grinding coffee beans, pulling shots of espresso and steaming milk at the same time, all the while conversing merrily with his customers. It was great theatre.
Oh, yeah.
And that is what gave Howard Schultz the idea he could take that theatre back to America, where at that time Starbucks, they were selling you beans for home, and his sort of great breakthrough vision, which came in Milan, was the theatre of the coffee bar is what could actually sell.
Mm-hmm. So all this to say, Milan espresso culture back in the 80s is what ultimately created a seed that kind of has directed really a lot of your life.
Absolutely.
30 years later.
Yeah.
And Howard Schultz completely revolutionized his way of seeing coffee, created what is today the Starbucks coffee experience. And now Italian-style coffee is everywhere.
Yep.
And if you were to really break down that Milan espresso experience that you had and Schultz had into its constituent components, I would argue that you have a combination of, number one, espresso-style coffee, two, like a theatrical stand-up bar culture, and three, the coffee itself being extremely affordable to the point where it is basically democratic. Anyone can have an espresso.
So, James, for most of coffee's history in Italy, it's very much none of those things.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, those three elements, on which I agree with you, have only come together surprisingly recently.
And to tell today's story, we actually went to Milan and visited the Espresso Machine Museum run by the Rancilio family. Rancilio are also the sponsors of the second series of A History of Coffee, and without their support, we couldn't have brought this free educational content to you today. I'm James Harper, a documentary maker and creator of the Filter Stories Coffee podcast.
And I'm Jonathan Morris, professional historian and author of Coffee, A Global History.
And this is the second series of A History of Coffee, a podcast where we explore how a tiny psychoactive seed changed the world and continues to shape our lives today. So, Jonathan, we're exploring the history of coffee in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
First question first. When did coffee first arrive to Italy?
We first know of coffee in Italy, right? In Venice. The great Venetian Republic, the big trading empire, really.
Right. So this is like the 1500s, also around the time when, Yemen has just become the coffee growing powerhouse of the world. And, coffee's being drank in coffee shops across the Arab world, North Africa, modern day Turkey.
Yeah. And we know that coffee then begins to appear in the manifests of apothecaries.
Okay.
So people prescribing coffee as a form of medicine.
Huh.
I don't think it's till the 1680s that we have a first credible record of somewhere serving coffee as a sit-down serve place in Venice.
Oh, wow. So we now have coffee moving from pharmacies through to what appears to be a coffee shop of some sort, some coffee house.
Venice does have, from around the mid-1700s, a very rapid expansion in coffee houses.
Uh-huh.
And the reason for that is because in the 1740s, the Venetians banned gambling.
Okay.
And the Venetians were a slave almost to gambling.
Oh, really?
So, where can you gamble if the gambling houses are closed? What you need is a front. So if you have a coffee shop and then you have a room in the back.
Oh, no way.
Oh, way.
This is like a speakeasy for gambling in a coffee shop.
Absolutely. So the coffee shops first start manifesting, as I say, in about the 1740s. And by the 1760s, they're bringing in legislation limiting their number because there's too many of them. And they've realized that this is what's really going on.
So coffee is clearly very popular because it's a front for gambling. But were people enjoying coffee, without the gambling, just appreciating coffee because it tastes good?
Oh, James, absolutely. There's actually a play written by the most famous Venetian playwright, Carlo Goldoni, in the 1750s. It's called La Bottega del Caffè, the coffee shop, and it has some wonderful snippets about coffee. You've got one of the characters complaining that even the facchini are the porters, the low-class people.
Right.
Anche I facchini venire a bevere il loro caffè.
So even the commoners come to drink coffee.
Exactly. And this guy who's the assistant in the coffee shop goes, yeah, and that woman who I have to take coffee to every morning, she almost always begs me to go and buy her some wood, and yet she wants to drink coffee.
Uh-huh.
Even though you're really poor and you haven't got enough money to buy wood, so you're begging for firewood, but nonetheless, she'll spend the money on the coffee.
Oh, I see. Now, Jonathan, last year I was cruising the streets of Padova in northern Italy because you had suggested that I visit a particular cafe to get an idea for what coffee was like for wealthy Italians in cafes in and around the 1800s.
Indeed.
So here I am at Cafe Pedrocchi, lounging back, enjoying the view. I mean, this is opulent. Opulent with a capital O. So I'm staring at the bar. It's all made of marble. Columns made of gold. The chairs are all made of red velvet. And you told me that this is an example of the grand cafes of Italy and Europe that spring up, from like the 1700s onwards. So what are these grand cafes?
These are wonderfully decorated ambiance cafes in which wealthy people, the nobility, the bureaucrats, the merchants, but also, I have to say, particularly in Italy, all of those sort of aristocrats who are doing the grand tour, the educational tour, would come and frequent them. But there's one thing that one would have to say, and that is the coffee brewing method is not anything different from what's going on elsewhere in Europe or indeed in Italy at home. So probably by the time we get into the 19th century, using just the pour-over coffee pot, upper chamber to lower chamber.
Kind of like the Neapolitan coffee maker. And if you don't know what that looks like, we've got a link in the show notes. So now I'm kind of confused because we're at the beginning of the 20th century and that coffee experience that Howard Schultz had, stand-up bar culture, espresso coffee, and it being very affordable for every Italian, we're nowhere near that yet. And it's only just over 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. But we are about to enter a period of rapid change, espresso style change. So let's start, though, with where that stand-up bar culture begins.
Tell me.
Okay, so that originates, James, with the appearance in Italy of what become known in Italian as the American bar.
The American bar?
And those begin spreading in Italy around the end of the 19th century, so in the principal cities with trade, money, and so forth.
For example, Milan.
Exactly. Milan, the commercial heart of Italy.
And Jonathan, to better demonstrate how stand-up bar culture worked in Italy 100 or so years ago, we actually met up in Milan ourselves to retrace the steps of a typical patron of this American bar, this cocktail bar.
Let's have a stroll. Let's go on a passeggiata, an evening stroll before dinner.
A very good idea. Yeah, so what we did, James, was retrace the steps of a typical Milan stockbroker at the end of a hard day in the early 20th century. We actually met, didn't we, just outside the Banca Commerciale.
So what are we looking at?
Yeah, well, this is the piazza where you have the Banca Commerciale Italiana, very, very big finance institution.
So we were pretending to be stock traders from 120 odd years ago, and we would have left work at, 5 o'clock? What would a 19th century stock trader do on a weekday evening in Milan?
You know what's right by? Just the world's most famous opera house. I think you'd go to the opera, don't you?
And yeah, the world-renowned La Scala was literally next door to the Banca Commerciale where you might have worked.
Oh, that's La Scala.
That's La Scala.
It's such a nondescript building.
Well, you think so, but till you get inside.
And let's say, you want to impress a client who's in town.
Probably son of a wealthy landowner, kind of person you feel that if you just impress them a little, treat them nice, this could end out well for you. So you're going to take them to the opera because this is Milan culture. Mm-hmm. But of course, what are you going to do before you get to the opera?
Well, you got a couple of hours to kill, right?
So you're going to take them through the most prestigious place to be seen in Milan. You're going to walk through the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II.
And it's extremely grand, the Galleria. I mean, you have this glass, heaven knows, 15 meters high above us.
I mean, if you're a 19th century resident of Milan and you see this, I mean, your head is blown, absolutely blown.
So the Galleria, as far as I'm concerned, is like a very high-class mall.
Yeah.
So the stock market broker, trying to impress his potential client, would have walked towards the Duomo, Milan's major cathedral.
It's an absolute Christmas cake of a building. And as we come out towards the Piazza Duomo, right under the porticos at the very end, we find this bar.
Camparino, which it's a little corner on
Camparino. This is still a stand-up only bar.
the side of the Galleria.
And I can imagine that our prospective client would have been very impressed. The bartenders, so well dressed.
White immaculate suits, right? Little red, black bow ties.
So, you've got to order the cocktail of the day.
What is the most traditional thing we could get? The thing you would have had 100 years ago?
Mito, Milano, Torino. Vermouth from Torino, Campari from Milano, Milano, Torino.
I'll have one.
Okay, allora 2 Milano, Torino.
I gotta say, Camparino, the space was spectacular. Huge mirrors everywhere. A chandelier above our heads that literally weighs about 100 kilos.
You wouldn't want to be standing underneath that if it fell, would you?
And Jonathan, while we were enjoying our cocktails, we were stood at the bar and there was a queue of people waiting to take our spot at the bar behind us.
But this is the great thing about the cocktail bar. This is the great thing about stand-up culture, isn't it? There are no waiters because the waiters are the barmen behind the counters. It's a very swift service.
Extremely.
Yeah, this is straight over the counter, service straight to you.
And so this is the origins of stand-up culture.
It absolutely is, yeah.
But Jonathan, here's a question.
But in the first iterations of these sorts of bars, would we have seen an espresso machine here at all?
In the very first ones, no.
If back then that stockbroker had instead asked for coffee, what would have happened?
There was no espresso coffee. And actually, it would have taken some time to make that coffee. And it would have been a bit of a downer, frankly. On everyone, a downer to take the time to make it, a bit of a downer to be drinking coffee because it would have felt a strange thing to do in those surroundings where you really want to kind of show yourself off.
So, I could absolutely see the value that an espresso machine would bring in this American bar concept like Camparino. Coffee that could be made fast, drank fast.
But also a coffee that can, as it were, add to that sense of theatre.
So, tell me about the first espresso machines that would have been in a bar like Camparino.
The two people who are responsible for those first machines going in are both from Milan. There's an engineer, a man called Luigi Bezzera. But the guy who's probably of interest here to us is his partner, the man who puts the money in. Because the man who puts the money in is a guy called Desiderio Pavoni. And Pavoni, which for those who don't know is peacock. And Mr. Pavoni is a peacock. He is an owner of theatres and of hospitality type places in the very smart areas of Milan. And in 1905, they begin producing the first machine, which they call La Pavoni Ideale, ideal. And they get the machine out in time for the 1906 World Exhibition held in Milan.
And the World Exhibition, we still have it around today. It's like a place where countries come to basically show off to each other.
And we have a fabulous picture of their stall in the corner of this exhibition.
Oh, yes. So I just Googled the image. It's a very large hall, like a market hall. And you have this L-shaped counter on the show floor.
Yep.
And you have all these waiters in black suits, black ties, black mustaches. And there's like 20, 30 saucers in front of them. The saucers which hold the espresso cups, waiting for someone to come up to the saucer and so they can serve them a cup of coffee. And in between them are ginormous fire hydrants with these big metal eagles on top.
Those fire hydrant looking machines are actually the first ever commercial espresso machines.
Right.
And James, can you read that sign above them?
Yeah, it says Bezzera L. Luigi Bezzera?
Luigi.
Caffè espresso.
But as you see, right from the beginning, espresso was being used by the manufacturers themselves.
So we now have a name for a new kind of coffee. And where exactly are these newfangled espresso machines being developed?
Most of the evolution of these machines takes place in Milan and its outskirts. What we tend to find is that in the first place, these machines, they're being made in little workshops that are knocking out a whole variety of different things, but are beginning to experience a demand for one of these that will go into bars. So there's about, 20, 30 workshops that you could find listed in the kind of Milan, Lombardy area.
Well, here we are on a summer day on the outskirts of Milan.
Yeah, and Jonathan, a few days after visiting Camporino, we actually went to visit one of those workshops.
Where are we, Jonathan?
We are in Parabiago, which is a kind of a suburb, I suppose, just north of Milan. And we are standing outside Officine Rancilio.
Today, this space is a beautiful museum with gorgeous antique coffee machines.
And I'm so glad to be back here, James, because I was here a long time ago. It's beautiful.
But before Rancilio turned this into a museum, it was the original workshop that back in the 20s, the guy who founded Rancilio, the company, this space, about as big as an apartment. This is where he hand-built his first espresso machines.
Yeah, exactly.
Buongiorno. Lei come si chiama? Giorgio Rancilio. Ah, proprio Rancilio.
And Jonathan, this bit was pretty cool. The Rancilio team had called in just for us, bona fide Rancilio family.
Rancilio royalty.
My name is Giorgio Rancilio. I am the grandson of Roberto Rancilio, that is the founder of Rancilio. I'm the former president and CEO of Rancilio Group.
Yeah, and for the next few hours, Giorgio took us on a journey through espresso machine history, explaining to us every major technological leap.
And a lot of the material that we recorded here on how the machines evolved technically over the years, I actually covered that in a separate podcast, The Science of Coffee, which I've linked in the show notes. But the key thing to know about these fire hydrant looking espresso machines is that they didn't actually produce coffee, which today we would consider an espresso.
It's like more similar to the mocha.
Yeah, something more similar really to what you get out of a Bialetti mocha pot, a somewhat weak, watery espresso.
And that's because they used steam pressure.
Approximately 1.5 bar.
Okay.
And 1.5 bars is a lot less compared to modern espresso machines, which use 9 bars of pressure.
So not very much pressure at all.
No. So just thinking back to that experience that Howard Schultz had. Number 1, rich, thick espresso. Number 2, theatricality. And number 3, very affordable. Number 1, dark, thick, strong espresso. We are not there yet with these fire hydrant looking machines, but they're very magnificent. So, the theatricality piece is slowly coming into play. And the third aspect, was this new form of espresso coffee affordable for everyday Italians?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, this would only be at that point the elite members of society, the people who'd be going to the kind of American bars and the Swiss hotels. Interestingly, the other thing is, who's drinking this? Tourists are drinking it. This new form of coffee becomes fairly quickly an image of Italy outside the country itself.
An image of Italy, despite the fact that so few Italians are actually drinking espresso coffee.
And now, James, things are going to get even more weird because we're now into the 1920s, and that brings us to the most contentious period of Italian history, of course, that of Italian fascism, Mussolini and the fascist regime. Because remember, the fascists come to power in 1922, but it's really about 1926 that they consolidate that power into dictatorship. And 1926 is also the year when they introduce a legislation which basically says that you shouldn't open places with espresso machines unless they are hotels for tourism.
Oh, right.
Because the espresso machine is encouraging the consumption of coffee, and coffee is a luxury good and it has to be imported, and we want to drive down the amount of imports because the fascists believe in what they call autarky, so kind of self-provision. Yeah. And consequently, you cannot open places with espresso machines.
Wow. So Mussolini's regime tries to stop Italians drinking as much coffee.
And in fact, what we see is a decline in coffee consumption per capita. Now, that's weird because what we also see is a rise in the number of people who say they're drinking coffee.
Huh?
What we see is actually, therefore, more people thinking they're drinking coffee and using what they believe are coffee products. But what they're actually using are coffee substitutes.
I see. So things that on the packet look like coffee, but they're probably stuffed full of things like chicory.
So coffee consumption comes down to about less than 0.8 kilos per annum, which is lower than Spain, less than half of Germany.
Wow.
A quarter of consumption for France.
Wow. That's wild. So all these Italians and the rest of the world are thinking, yeah, Italy and coffee, they go hand in hand. But the reality is they're not actually drinking coffee.
It's actually the case that fascism and coffee don't mix. Because you've got the image of coffee, but not the reality of coffee.
So Jonathan, we're now in the late 40s. The Second World War is over. Mussolini is now dead. I would imagine that now Italian life is getting back to some semblance of normal.
Actually, in a way, what's really fascinating is that this is the time that experience that Schultz has in Milan, the classic Italian espresso coffee experience, it's now in these next 15 years that it's going to come together. We're really going into the espresso period of espresso history. Yeah. There are three facets, of course, we said: the affordable coffee, the rich, creamy espresso, and the theatricality. And actually, where this starts is a major innovation in theatricality. By the way, behind you is the world's most beautiful coffee machine.
Yeah, so when we were in Milan, we also went to visit another coffee machine museum, MUMAC, il Museo delle Macchine per Espresso Gruppo Cimbali. And there was this moment where I saw the cool, analytical historian, Jonathan Mars, getting a little bit emotional.
Yeah. Wow, I'm so overwhelmed to see this, actually. I know what you mean. The cornuta. Okay, this is the Gioponti. DP47. This is a Pavoni machine, and they brought in the great designer Gioponti. If you look in through the world of design history, everyone will talk about this machine. I mean, just look at the sweep on that.
It looks like an engine from a super fast car, as you see.
Yeah, like a Formula One car almost. Feeling it has like a speedboat, actually, that era of speedboat design.
And dear listener, we have a link in the show notes so you can check it out for yourself.
And it's the start of a whole period in which actually espresso machine design, by which I mean the aesthetics of the machine, as much as the technology, are transformed by, the employment of professional designers. That leads to all kinds of new looking, very attractive machines.
But why bring in a world-renowned designer for a thing that just makes espresso coffee?
Because of the theatre of looking at that machine. That machine's going on your bar. If you saw that in 1947 for the first time, you would experience a meltdown. Anyone would.
Espresso is becoming really great theatre now. Okay, so by the late 40s, stand-up bar culture, this theatricality, that's already established. Got it. But we still have two missing pieces to Schultz's espresso experience: affordable coffee and a much more thick, luscious espresso.
Absolutely.
So in this rapid period of development in the next 15 years, back at the Rancilio Museum,
That's yours.
Giorgio Rancilio showed us the innovation that gave us rich, luscious espresso.
And this start the era of the lever machine. So
Piston lever espresso machines.
So the barista with the lever pulls and charges the spring that release the energy and push the water to the coffee.
And Giorgio Rancilio explained that these piston lever machines finally deliver that rich, creamy espresso experience that Schultz had, including, for the first time, crema.
Crema, exactly. And in fact, at this time, they called the resultant beverage crema cafe. It wasn't cafe espresso, it was crema cafe, precisely to distinguish it from what had been known as espresso previously.
So Jonathan, now we're in the 50s. These lever machines have been invented. They produce crema. We have stand-up bar culture. We have really theatrical-looking espresso machines. I mean, the last thing we need now for the Schultz trifecta of experience is affordable coffee. So at what point does the everyday Italian actually start to enjoy this kind of espresso coffee?
So this is what starts to happen really in the 50s and 60s, James, because this is the time in which Italian society is massively changing. It's the biggest upheaval in the social lives of ordinary Italians connected with the transformation of the Italian economy.
What's changing?
What's changing is where people live and the work that they do. Because basically, even after the war, the majority of people still live in the countryside and work in agriculture or agriculture-related type things. Now, in that post-war era, there is a massive migration away from those places into the Italian cities. They're taking jobs in industries that are beginning to be re-established following the war and in services. So we're seeing a switch from basically an agrarian economy to now a much more urban economy. So there's a lot of housing being built. There's a lot of people coming into the cities who are getting very small places to live.
Right.
So these people come in terms of places to socialize, in terms of places to spend time, there's not much options. So little coffee bars, preferably coffee bars that have a TV, become the place to go. So a bar with a TV is a really popular place.
Wow.
The Italian bar, it's not just a coffee bar, it's an all-day bar. Usually goes from the morning into the evening, and it becomes, a place that you go in the morning to sort of greet your friends with your first coffee of the day, or to take your coffee break from coming out of the workshop or the factory. And then it becomes, your after dinner coffee, followed by maybe a drink, followed by watching what's ever on the television, because you don't have a television.
They're expensive, right, back then?
Right?
Interesting. So it's really only in the 50s that the espresso bar, the stand-up espresso bar, actually starts having a place in, daily Italian life.
Yes, that's right. But we're not quite there yet, because we have the concept, but the concept still has to spread to every corner of Italy.
So how fast does this bar concept spread?
There's about a third increase in the number of coffee bars in Italy in 15 years, between sort of 56 and 70.
Wow.
That is the big explosion of coffee bars.
So Italian coffee bars are exploding everywhere because Italians are migrating to the cities. They want a place to hang out.
And actually, there's another further reason for that explosion, and it comes down to some very important technological innovations in espresso machines.
Yeah, and actually, Giorgio Rancilio showed us some of those innovations.
The motor pump.
And he explained to us that by introducing an automatic pump, that did away with the lever.
It changed everything in terms of temperature control and they reduced also the margin of error, let's say.
And the second innovation Giorgio showed us was the heat exchanger.
The water in the heating exchanger is heated by the water of the boiler.
And essentially what he's talking about is that the water is now heated up by kind of going through a corkscrew as it makes its way through the boiler. And I go into more technical depth in The Science of Coffee.
But James, the point is this, with these innovations then, espresso can be made much faster with much less disruption.
And so how does this impact the lives of everyday Italians?
Well, a great deal, because this basically makes it very easy to have functioning small neighborhood coffee bars. So you could be a single operator, but you can whip out the coffee after coffee after coffee without a problem. You can pretty much have one or two people running your bar and people coming in and out all the time.
So it brings the costs down.
It brings the costs down. So all of these habits begin to form. The idea of the Italian coffee break, walk out the office, light up a cigarette, get to the coffee bar, whack down your coffee, walk back to the office, 15 minutes, whole thing's done. Lovely.
Boom.
Perfect.
And this is it. We finally arrived at the moment where basically any Italian, rich or poor, young or old, can enjoy real 100% coffee whenever they want it.
So let's not forget what happened then after that, soon after. Howard Schultz goes to Italy, he tries this coffee, he tries above all that experience, and he goes on to spearhead the rise of Starbucks, the popularization of espresso-style, Italian-style coffee globally. And that gets taken further by the global specialty coffee movement, which of course begins very, very espresso-focused.
So here's an uncomfortable truth. Jonathan, as you know, I am half Italian. My mother's Italian and my parents live in Italy. And every time I go to visit them and have, an espresso in any regular coffee bar, I struggle. I'm used to sweet, aromatic espressos, and these are anything but.
The thing is here, James, that what's happened is that, Italy was the center of the whole of espresso movement. And we now have that specialty movement in the rest of the world.
Yeah, but Italian espresso machine companies are at the heart of the specialty coffee movement and are extremely export focused. And Giorgio Rancilio spoke to that.
Rancilio in 2020, the percentage was 90% export, 10% Italy.
And it doesn't stop at just exporting machines. They also open flagship stores and training spaces abroad. And to give an example, even here in Berlin, where I live, the other day, we both, Jonathan, you and I, we went to Rancilio's BER station, which is kind of like their flagship store training institute. And I spoke with an absolute Berlin specialty coffee veteran.
I'm Nicole Battefeld-Montgomery. I'm the head of education for Rancilio in Germany.
And honestly, I've lost count of the number of coffee championships Nicole has won. But this site is a serious investment. I mean, it's right off Kurfürstendamm, which is like a major shopping street in West Berlin.
Oh, yeah.
And I got the impression they're putting in an enormous amount of energy.
I want this place to be sharing passion with other people. So they come here, we have a cup of coffee, maybe an excellent quality of coffee that I haven't had before. And then they go out of here being like, oh my God, I want to maybe make my shop better, train my baristas a little bit more.
And just to make another really stark contrast, in Italy, if you go to an espresso bar, the espresso machine is going to be pretty standard. But those same Italian espresso machine companies create unbelievable innovation for non-Italians.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And actually, Jonathan, you want a quick story?
Yeah, go on.
So one of my first jobs in coffee was actually working for a roastery in Australia, and we sold Rancilio espresso machines.
Yeah.
And get this, I became the 3 month in a row top salesman for Rancilio machines.
Really? James, fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you. But the point is this. While I was working there, Rancilio had recently introduced this very new technology to some of their top-of-the-line machines called advanced temperature profiling.
Uh-huh.
I think this is a very revolutionary system.
Basically, what they've done is found a way to change the brewing temperature over the course of extraction.
Yeah.
Right. So you could start your espresso at 93 degrees and you could program it to finish at 88, 5 degrees of difference. You could also go the other way around, start at 88, go up to 93.
We discovered that simply fine-tuning the temperature of the machine during the extraction changes the result.
I remember playing with this thing back in Melbourne and finding all these really surprising espresso flavors.
So I think there is an irony here, which is that the same machines, imagine the nerding that can go on, and I bet you sold them that way too, with a machine like that. But I mean, basically, a neighborhood coffee bar in Italy wants something that can turn on, do the coffee, turn off.
Right.
Bang. And the average Italian coffee consumer is looking for a simple Italian espresso experience. Italy has been slow to adopt specialty because, in a sense, Italy thinks it already does specialty because it's doing espresso as its mass culture.
So, Jonathan, today, what are the biggest changes going on in the Italian coffee market? What are Italians drinking?
It's not actually what's going on in the coffee shops. The biggest change is pods. Yeah. To put it bluntly, whereas Starbucks is only just becoming a little bit of a player in Italy, Nespresso has cleaned the market. And now pods are everywhere. I think I've told you that I started my experience in Italy with a year in Bologna. I went back to Bologna a few years ago, and there, in the main piazza in Bologna, is an espresso boutique. I mean, I just find that...
Wow. There we go.
Incredible.
There we go.
Just incredible. Yeah.
Wow. So it's kind of funny when you reflect back on the whole story, you know. Coffee comes to Italy. It also has this stand-up bar culture. The two of them and espresso machine development come together, create this thing, espresso with crema. It's exported across the world. It revolutionizes so many people's coffee experience. And yet in the country where it started, people revert to pods. You know, as somebody who considers themselves Italian, well, certainly half Italian, it's not the story I wish had happened. Let's put it that way.
I do understand where you're going with that. There are some nice places that are beginning to do specialty things, but with an Italian angle to them. But I still think it's the only country where as soon as I land, I'm literally in the airport, I will get out, go to the coffee counter and thump down an espresso. And I know it won't taste like a specialty espresso or any great thing, but somehow it makes me feel I'm back in the culture. Because that's the thing really, isn't it? It's a culture around espresso that Italy has created. So, thanks for listening to this, the third episode in the History of Coffee podcast, Series 2.
And do tell me, Jonathan, what is coming up in the next and final episode?
There's a country called America.
Never heard of it.
It's quite big. We want to understand, I think, this American love affair with coffee. And what we're going to show, I think, is that actually, through the medium of friends, we can come to understand that coffee in America is a bit more of a myth than it is a history.
Dun, dun, dun. And if you are dying to listen to that right now, it is already out on the History of Coffee podcast channel. I got a link in the show notes.
If you're still interested in Italian coffee and thinking about that, go over to our social media. You'll find me at Coffee History JM, and I'm going to be putting up images of Italian coffee history through the ages, those great places, Venice, through the grand cafes, right up to what's happening today. And James, what about you?
So on my Instagram at Filter Stories Podcast, I'll put up images of some of those beautiful Rancilio machines we saw at the Rancilio Museum. So you can see espresso history up close.
Of course, if you want to get deeper into the history of coffee, I humbly recommend my book, Coffee, A Global History.
Great book, heartily recommend it. And if you haven't already, please do press subscribe so you don't miss future episodes on this channel. And one thing you can do to help others find this show, you know, other coffee nerds, history nerds, maybe coffee history nerds, write a review on Apple Podcast, because that really helps the algorithm show this podcast to people who love history, who love coffee. And another thing you could do if you are on Instagram is take a screen grab of you listening to this podcast and then post it on Instagram as a story. Tag me at Filter Stories Podcast. Tag you, Jonathan,
at Coffee History JM.
And we can thank you directly.
Which will be our pleasure. Meanwhile, I think it's very important, particularly for this episode, to thank Rancilio, who enabled us to create this free educational content about the history of coffee, and of course in this episode about the history of Italian coffee, of which they are an important part.
And if you, dear listener, are in the market for a home espresso machine, perhaps a coffee machine on your bar, do consider Rancilio. By supporting them, you're also supporting us creating this content, and we have a link in the show notes, so thank you. A History of Coffee is produced by myself, James Harper, and you, Jonathan Morris, and I write and play the piano music.
We look forward to seeing you again, and meanwhile, why not go off and get yourself a really good espresso?